as a co-founder of Tip News and looking at so much of mental health being triggered and basically going in the wrong direction because of the wrong information, you could say, or how news portrays things. Tell us how you're trying to combat that with Tip News, which is an unbiased platform, news platform.
Yeah. When we start to work in human health, environmental health, any of these things, as we've touched on, there are usually forces, industries that have things set in a way that they enjoy, they appreciate. We have people profiting, unfortunately, off of problems most of the time. And if you work in either of those spaces and you start to do something that doesn't align with those current modalities and ways of thinking, you're seen as a disruptor. You're somebody that is not friendly to the institutions that are already in place. And so when I started as an activist just learning about glyphosate and genetically modified foods, many people know, Monsanto was, pretty infamously demonized. They're now owned by Bayer. They bought them a couple of years ago. But they were not super happy about people learning about genetically modified foods, or they weren't going to root on, this movement of people saying, I want to know if my food is labeled. So we tried to actually get a bill passed to label foods if they had genetic engineering. We thought the public deserved to know if their food was, altered genetically. What a wild concept. And when we saw, with all the grassroots efforts that we did, the way in which we were outspent by these industries, initially that campaign we worked on in California at the time, it didn't pass. We did set a wave in motion that led to much more awareness. That is, eventually it did change things, and it changed, the labeling. But we saw the power of money and the power of special interests. Now, in the same way, when it comes to media, we know that over 90% of what we read or we watch or we listen to is controlled by about 6 companies. And so about 15 billionaires, run those companies. And it goes back to this idea of centralization versus decentralization. Nature does not reward centralization. It means it's more unstable. It means it's more ripe for corruption. And it's not a big discovery right now that when we have, special interests on one side of our news platform and other interests on the other, that we have this divisive media. Everybody's feeling it. The politics of bias that are affecting what we hear and what we see and the ways in which headlines are written. There was a golden era of journalism where you were just provided the facts, and it was your responsibility as a reader to do what you wanted to with that. And the psychology of business and presenting media has rewarded the bias, because it's just an inevitable process that people want to hear what they believe, right? This is called confirmation bias. And so we see this now with social media. If anybody has watched the film The Social Dilemma, we know that, the algorithms are quite literally curated to give you more of what you already believe, reinforce your vision of the world. And with that's going to come serious tribalism. And with tribalism comes, I'm the good guy, they're the bad guy. How do we tap into the ego if we were, trying to get more clicks, trying to get more advertising dollars as a news station or an article and a headline and a clickbait online? You want to tell people what they want to see. It's very rare these days for people to seek out things that contradict their beliefs. No one wants to be proven wrong, right? It's just built into our psychology of our ego. And so these news companies, they know that. And we've watched, especially over the last couple of years, for a number of reasons, as these tribes become more and more divided, but also more and more aggressive in their blame or their belief that it's really we're in trouble because of those other people on the other side. And this illusion of binary where it's them versus us constantly. And if nothing else, it doesn't even have to get into some massive conspiracy theory. It's just that this is good business, because you click on these things and you are rewarded for, reading this article and learning more about how, gosh, if everybody just thought like you, we'd be so much better. And unfortunately, this isn't leading us down a good path. A lot of people know this now. And I think the loudest voices are the ones that are on the extreme opposite ends. But really, the majority of people, whether it's Americans or even globally, I do think that they have a little bit more compassion for people that are different, that think differently, that live differently, that have different beliefs and cultures. They really don't mind, as long as it's not affecting them or causing something dangerous. But this yearning to come together, to have more compassion for your neighbor, to see the humanity in somebody who's arrived at a different conclusion, whether it's about their environmental beliefs, their medical beliefs, their political beliefs. So we said, how can we heal this? Is there something that is providing just the facts? And like with a lot of the work that I've done, it was mostly just driven out of, I wish this existed. I wish this was the newsletter and the news that I was getting. So we started Tip News, and the idea is, we're providing the most need to know details for people that are kind of fed up with. If I look at one news platform, it's so biased in one direction. You see the same headline bias in the other direction. But where is that middle ground? And that respect for the reader is not really there anymore in mainstream news. It's often telling people what to think. So a lot of people want to be told what to think, which I think is a habit that we have to get out of, which is, why can't we just sit in the unknown a little bit? We don't have to know everything. We don't have to say, this is right, that is wrong. It's the humility of just saying, all right, tell me what happened. And I don't need an opinion necessarily on every single topic. So Tip News has been really great in that we have people from both sides of the political spectrum that we've seen that feedback of, that they appreciate, that we're stripping out a lot of the bias. And really it's fear mongering, right? Our brains are hardwired to notice if something's dangerous and to pay more attention to that. And so any way that we can reduce, this intentional fear mongering and sensationalism and political agenda, that's the goal. So that's the mission. So we've created this really cool free newsletter at tip.news. Anybody can check it out. And, we want to be held accountable. That's the beautiful thing, is we're an independent company. We're not, tied to the interests of, for one, big pharmaceutical companies, big chemical companies, or big companies from any industry, oil companies, you name it, that have interests and control and influence, sitting on the boards, literally, of media companies and making sure that they report in certain ways. That stuff is very real. No theories needed. It's just business incentive, to have people speaking well on your behalf and to run ads for you. And so, we're doing our best to try to create the most unbiased news platform there is. And it's a big mission, but it's come at a time when most people are abandoning legacy media. Yeah. They know that they've lost their trust, and there's really no way for them to get it back. No way, no matter how much they scramble and try to rebrand. It's corporate interests, and it's the same monopolies that are at the heads of those pyramids. And so trying to do something different. And I think that that's a big piece of mental wellness. As we look at healing our culture, is, how are we participating and staying in the know on things? Because for a while, a lot of people just stopped watching the news or still don't, because it's like, I can't watch it. It's so depressing, or it's so clearly a narrative. And so unless you want to just be completely living under a rock and not knowing what's going on, which is unfortunately kind of the only option in many ways, until, other independent sources like ours start to help provide the news in a really easy to read way without, jamming these divisive narratives down our throats.
Yeah, it's really important, especially when you look at it from that mental health aspect, because most of these biased news stations are selling fear porn in some ways, trying to keep you scared, using narratives that keep you in a certain state of fear, anxiety, glued to the television, because you get addicted to fear. But fear is terrible. And I was reading this. on the news, but it was basically saying that now ER rooms aren't overwhelmed by people who have infectious disease, let's say, but who have mental health issues, who are coming to hospitals with suicidal ideology, with anxiety. That's awful. And it's usually kids, they're saying, they're the most impacted by it. And, kids don't need that kind of fear. Like, kids should be looking forward to a life that is something, worth living for, and very happy about that. It's a sad state when you have kids run into the ER thinking they want to kill themselves, right?
Yeah.
And you got to look not just at the news, of course, social media, everything else going on out there, but then you got to look at the generation that's bringing them up, and what our roles and responsibilities are to the younger generation that's having such a tough time. So yeah, Tip News sounds like a good counterbalance in some ways, at least to that effect.